I've really tried not to respond to that. First of all, it's complete hogwash. My sister would never, ever do anything to harm a child, especially not a child in our own family." With that one controlled sentence, Dionne Warwick shut down a rumor on camera. But what the world didn't see was the weight behind her eyes. For nearly 10 years, according to those close to her, she had chosen silence. She watched strangers dissect the Houston family on television, watched headlines turn their grief into entertainment, while she carried a private story that followed her into every interview, every dressing room, every sleepless night. People in the inner circle say that on the surface, Dionne kept her composure. But quietly, she was guarding something the Houstons never wanted the public to touch. A pattern so precise, it felt like a blueprint. 2 women, Whitney Houston and her only daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, dying in almost the exact same way in 2 different states, 3 years apart. Both found face down in a bathtub. Both surrounded by hot water and questions. To some, that looked like coincidence. To Dionne, as she would later hint, it felt like confirmation of something Whitney herself had feared. Because months before her own death, Whitney was believed to have whispered a warning, a confession Dionne never repeated in public until much later. She spoke about a bad feeling, a shadow over the women in her bloodline, a sense that whatever waited for them was not random. Why did the same nightmare play out twice? What exactly was Whitney so afraid of? And what is this so-called curse that Dionne says has haunted the Houston women for decades, not as a ghost story, but as a pattern? Tonight we open the file they kept closed. The file that doesn't just ask how Whitney and Bobby died, but why their final moments look like mirror images of each other. The further you follow this trail, the darker the questions become. Every curse, at least the way families talk about them, has an origin point. And according to Dionne Warwick's later recollections, the Houston story didn't begin in a Beverly Hills mansion or under Grammy spotlights. It started long before that, in spaces no camera ever filmed: crowded dressing rooms, whispered prayer circles, hotel bathrooms where the steam hung a little too thick, like the air itself was warning them. In 1984, Whitney Houston's rise was so fast that people in the industry described it as almost unreal. One moment she was the quiet church girl from Newark, singing in sanctuaries and small rooms. The next, she was under global lights so bright they seemed designed to expose every flaw, every fear. Dionne would later admit she felt uneasy from the beginning, not because Whitney lacked talent or discipline, but because the ascent felt unnaturally steep. "Stars that bright," she reportedly told her younger cousin backstage, "have a way of burning out before anyone can pull them back." Whitney would just laugh it off, adjusting an earring or smoothing her dress, but Dionne swears the warning signs were already there. By 1986, the first cracks had started to show. Whitney, only 23, began experiencing sudden, unexplained waves of panic before certain performances. Right before major stages in Miami, Chicago, London, crew members say her hands would start to shake. Her breathing would shorten. In some moments, she would grab Dionne's wrist so tightly that faint red marks lingered hours later. "I feel like something's waiting for me out there," she once muttered in a backstage bathroom in Los Angeles, staring not at the mirror, but at the tiled floor. No one understood what she meant. Whitney refused to go into detail. The lights would come up, the band would start, and the fear would get buried beneath applause and stadium noise. Then came 1988 to 1990, the stretch Dionne would later refer to as the Awakening. During long world tours, from Tokyo high-rises to Toronto suites, Whitney began sharing something she never spoke about in public. According to people who were there, she confided that she felt a strange pull whenever she stayed too long in a bathtub. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a literal voice. She described it more like a presence, a weight, a calling that made her skin prickle. "It's like something's trying to get my attention," she reportedly whispered to Dionne one night inside a dim MGM Grand penthouse in Las Vegas. The lamp was low, the curtains drawn, the city buzzing somewhere far below. Dionne brushed it off as exhaustion, the kind that comes from touring, fame, and constant scrutiny. Whitney disagreed. She said it didn't feel like stress. It felt personal. While Whitney tried to keep these episodes hidden from the industry, the Houston matriarch gospel powerhouse, backbone of the family, seemed to sense something too. One quiet Thanksgiving dinner in Newark, she leaned in toward Dionne over plates of half-finished food and said a single sentence she never fully explained. "The women in this family don't get peaceful endings." At first, Dionne assumed it was just a mother's anxiety, a blunt warning about the brutality of fame and the way the industry chews up black women who dare to be extraordinary. But the way she said it, flat, cold, almost resigned, felt less like a warning and more like a verdict that had already been delivered. That was the first time Dionne heard a phrase that would later echo through private hallways and kitchen corners in the Houston household. The Houston curse. It wasn't spoken of as magic. It wasn't framed as demons or superstition. Inside the family, people described it more like an inheritance, trauma, unresolved pain, emotional patterns passed from one generation of women to the next, moving quietly through the bloodline, waiting for soft spots to surface. Whenever the idea came up, Whitney waved it away, rolling her eyes, changing the subject. But according to Dionne, her eyes always told a different story. There was a flash of recognition there, like she knew exactly what they were talking about and wanted no part of it. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, Dionne says the signs were all lined up in plain sight. The panic attacks, the whispered confessions about bathtubs, the strange comments from the family matriarch, the dizzying, unstoppable rise that seemed too bright, too perfect, too fragile. The curse, as some in the family privately called it, did not begin in 2012. It did not begin with Bobby Brown. If you believe the people who were there, it began decades earlier, in quiet rooms and heavy air long before Whitney Houston even understood that she might be in danger. Every family legend has a moment when it stops being a whisper and becomes impossible to ignore. For Dionne Warwick, that moment arrived on what was supposed to be the happiest day of Whitney Houston's life, her wedding day. The 18th of July, 1992, Mendham, New Jersey. The summer air was thick, the kind of humid heat that makes the horizon shimmer. The Houston estate was dressed like a fairy tale, white roses lining the walkways, candles flickering in glass holders, soft gospel music floating over manicured lawns. To the cameras, it looked like the perfect scene. America's sweetheart marrying R&B's notorious wild card. But the second Whitney appeared in her wedding gown. Stepping into the sunlight, Dionne reportedly felt a chill run up her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Whitney was radiant, glowing in lace and satin. Yet her eyes, Dionne would later say, looked like someone smiling while watching something approach from behind, a brightness edged with quiet dread. During the ceremony, Whitney's hands shook twice, small tremors she disguised by tightening her grip on the bouquet. When she whispered her vows, her voice didn't crack from romance. Dionne would describe it later as a flash of panic slipping through the performance. After the reception, as photographers yelled her name and camera flashes turned the garden into a storm of light, Dionne pulled the family matriarch aside. "Is she really all right?" she asked. The reply was quick, almost dismissive. "You know how weddings are, just nerves." But Dionne didn't buy it. Something felt wrong. And 6 months later, her instincts were no longer just a feeling. By January 1993, Whitney had changed. Her team began reporting canceled rehearsals. Makeup artists noticed her hands trembling slightly as they touched up her face for magazine covers. Friends of Bobby Brown were said to be drifting in and out of the Atlanta house at all hours. Inside those walls, arguments reportedly erupted without warning. Nights filled with raised voices, slamming doors, glass shattering in rooms no one wanted to talk about later. Whitney's sleep evaporated. She paced hallways at 2 and 3 a.m., drifting from room to room like she was searching for a place where her mind would finally quiet down. Some days, she barely left her bedroom. Other days, she barely spoke at all. In 1994, while preparing for a recording session in Los Angeles, Whitney locked herself in a bathroom for nearly an hour. When she finally emerged, people who saw her said her skin looked drained of color, her eyes glassy and distant. To avoid alarming anyone, she simply muttered, "I got dizzy." Later, in a private moment, Whitney told Dionne something much more unsettling. She claimed she had felt a pressure in that bathroom, like something pressing down on her chest, like being watched by something she couldn't see. Dionne begged her to slow down, to step back from the chaos, to breathe. Whitney gave a tired, almost mechanical smile and changed the subject. The calls began in 1995. Always late, always urgent, always from bathrooms. The one that Dionne can't forget came in 1996, from Whitney's gated house in North Atlanta. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the phone rang. When Dionne answered, Whitney's voice sounded cracked, fragile, as if it might break completely with one more word. "Aunt Dionne, it's here." "What's here?" "It follows me. It waits in the corners. And when I'm in the tub, I feel it the most." Her breathing turned jagged, almost childlike. "It's going to take me. I know it." On the other end of the line, Dionne was frozen. This wasn't the Whitney the world recognized, the dazzling performer with the impossible range. This was a woman cornered by a fear she couldn't name, whispering from a bathroom floor. Dionne tried to calm her, tried to talk her through the panic. Then the call cut off. Whitney hung up without warning. For years, Dionne kept that moment locked away, convincing herself that it was stress, exhaustion, maybe a desperate cry for help. But after Whitney's death, that memory changed shape. It felt less like a breakdown and more like a premonition she hadn't known how to hear. As Whitney's marriage to Bobby frayed, so did the family's sense of safety. At gatherings in Newark or Atlanta, Whitney often drifted around the room as if her body was there, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Relatives recall her avoiding eye contact, smiling politely, then slipping away to sit alone. Fights between Bobby and the Houston family occasionally spilled into public view. Sharp words backstage at award shows, icy stares at holiday events. Tabloids caught fragments. Whitney looking exhausted, Bobby agitated, family members trying to hold everything together. What the cameras didn't capture was the private disintegration behind those glossy covers. In 1997, during a family visit, Dionne reportedly found Whitney curled up on a guest bed. She was thinner. She shook. Her voice cracked before she could finish a sentence. When Dionne helped her sit up, Whitney whispered something that would haunt her for years. This didn't start with Bobby. It started before him. It's always been here. That was the moment Dionne says she understood that, in Whitney's mind, she wasn't just overwhelmed by fame or trapped in a turbulent relationship. She felt stalked by something older, some pattern she believed was stitched into the Houston bloodline itself. By 1999, Whitney's unraveling was getting harder to hide. Tour staff remembered her disappearing right before shows, sometimes refusing to go near hotel bathtubs. In Chicago, she reportedly refused a bath altogether, insisting on a lukewarm shower with barely any water pressure. A backup singer overheard her mutter, "I don't want to see it again," though no one knew what it was supposed to be. At home, the situation grew more volatile. Police records show multiple visits to the Atlanta residence between 1999 and 2003. The public blamed drugs, chaos, and domestic tension. Dionne saw something layered beneath all that. Repetition, escalation, a shadow growing sharper each year. In 2004, during a tense family intervention attempt in New Jersey, Whitney grabbed Dionne's hand and left her with one final clue she wouldn't fully decode until later. "If anything takes me, don't think it's new. It's old. Older than all of us. The family curse. The water. The fear that, according to these accounts, started long before Bobby Brown ever entered the picture." When Dionne looks back now, she points to this era as the turning point, the point at which the so-called curse stopped hiding in whispered comments and private anxieties and started stepping into the open. This was the chapter where, in her eyes, it stopped whispering and finally showed its teeth. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Some tragedies strike out of nowhere, like a sudden storm. Others move slowly, step by step, leaving a trail of warning signs that only make sense after it's too late. According to Dionne Warwick, the week before the 11th of February 2012, the week Whitney Houston died, felt, in hindsight, less like random chaos and more like a countdown nobody realized had already started. Grammy Week in Los Angeles, February 2012 should have been a celebration. Insiders say it was supposed to mark a kind of return. Whitney Houston, the voice, the icon, re-emerging in the industry that once crowned her untouchable. The Beverly Hilton buzzed with executives, velvet ropes, and champagne. Younger artists whispered about spotting her in the lobby. Photographers lingered in the hallways, hoping to catch that famous smile one more time. But behind the polished mirrors and rehearsed red carpet moments, a different story was unfolding, one that only a few people claimed to have seen. On February 6, Whitney checked into the Beverly Hilton with a tight-knit entourage. Her longtime stylist, a woman who had worked with her since the early 1990s, later described to Dionne how unsettled Whitney seemed from the moment her bags hit the floor. As she unpacked, she kept glancing over her shoulder, asking quietly if anyone had been in the room before she arrived. She said the air felt crowded, the stylist reportedly told Dionne. The next day, February 7, during a fitting in the suite, Whitney walked into the bathroom and froze. From where she stood, the mirror showed her back, and, according to the stylist's account, Whitney swore she saw a dark shape move behind her reflection. She came out a few moments later, visibly shaken, her hands faintly trembling. In a lowered voice, she said, "Someone was standing behind me in there." The stylist checked the bathroom. It was empty. No one hiding, no one inside. Still, Whitney refused to go back into that bathroom alone for the rest of the night. Someone always had to stand in the doorway, just in case. By February 8, hotel staff had noticed another strange pattern. Whitney was taking showers with the music turned all the way up so loud it bled through the walls. Her bodyguard later recalled hearing her sing at full force over the blaring tracks, like she was trying to drown out something else entirely. When he asked why the volume was so extreme, Whitney reportedly avoided his eyes and said, "It keeps my mind quiet." That evening, she appeared at a pre-Grammy event. Cameras captured a familiar performance. Whitney smiling, laughing, greeting friends, hugging people she hadn't seen in years. But when Dionne watched the footage, she said she recognized something very specific. Whitney, she explained, knew how to smile without letting her eyes join in, and that night, her eyes looked like someone pacing inside a locked room. Whitney left the event early, saying she felt like she was being watched. On February 9, the tension in her suite escalated. A staff member delivering food later reported hearing Whitney talking to someone, arguing, her voice rising and breaking. But when the door opened, she was alone. Inside, Whitney was pacing the room, tears on her face, suddenly shouting at what appeared to be empty air. "Leave me alone. I'm tired." When the staff member tried to comfort her, Whitney shook her head and whispered, "Not you. It's not you." She wouldn't explain who or what she meant. The following day, February 10, Dionne phoned Whitney to check on her. The call, by Dionne's account, lasted less than 2 minutes. But she remembers every second. Whitney's voice sounded thin and worn, like it was dragging itself through the receiver. She insisted she was fine, but then added a single sentence that stayed with Dionne like a splinter. "I just want this week to be over." When Dionne asked why, Whitney paused. There was a stretch of quiet, then 5 words. "You wouldn't understand," she said, before ending the call. Then came the final day. The 11th of February 2012. The morning began uneventfully, at least on the surface. Whitney rehearsed lightly, made and took a few calls, and continued preparing for Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammy party. To hotel staff and passing guests, she looked busy, distracted, but not alarmingly unstable. But around 2:45 p.m., according to accounts later shared with the family, Whitney made a simple request in her suite. She wanted a bath drawn, very hot, as hot as the water could get. When the tub was prepared, steam reportedly billowed out of the bathroom so thick that it clung to the hallway when the door opened. Her last known movements are described as calm, almost unnervingly ordinary, no screaming, no visible meltdown, just quiet routine. At 3:36 p.m., Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in the bathtub of room 434. The water, according to later reports, was still extremely hot. Her body showed signs of sudden distress, hands curled, face turned downward into the water. Investigators, doctors, and commentators would go on to talk about contributing factors: substances, stress, physical strain. But for Dionne, what seared itself into her mind wasn't just the autopsy language, it was the phone call that hit her moments after the news started spreading. She remembers the moment vividly: the room she was in, the television flickering with breaking alerts, the way her own heartbeat seemed to slow when the phone rang. A family member was on the line. Their voice shook. They said 3 words: "It's the bathtub." Dionne's response was almost immediate. "I know," she whispered. Because in her mind, this wasn't just about where Whitney died. It was about everything Whitney had said before. The panic in bathrooms, the confessions about feeling watched in the water, the late-night phone calls, the hot steam that made her feel like something was closing in. To Dionne, this wasn't random. This was the pattern finally reaching its endpoint, a pattern she believed had been stalking the women in her family for years. And the part that haunted her most was this: no one realized that what happened in that Beverly Hilton bathroom was not the conclusion of a story. It was the midpoint. Because 3 years later, in a quiet Georgia townhouse, the same scene would unfold again, almost beat for beat. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. If Whitney's death felt like fate finally catching up, Bobbi Kristina's felt like fate circling back to finish a script it had already written. For Dionne Warwick, the similarities weren't just chilling, they were impossible to dismiss. The roots of Bobbi Kristina's tragedy didn't begin in 2015. They reached back years, to New Jersey in 2008, when she was just 15. She and Whitney were visiting family when Bobbi suddenly refused to use the upstairs bathroom. When Dionne gently asked why, Bobbi answered with a sentence that echoed her mother's buried fears from decades earlier. "I don't like bathtubs. I feel like someone's watching me when I sit in them." Dionne froze. It was the same unease Whitney had voiced years before. The same trembling energy. The same haunted look in the eyes. Over the next few years, Bobbi lived inside the storm of her mother's unraveling. She was there backstage as Whitney tried to hold performances together. She heard argument tones muffled by hotel doors. She watched tension coil around holiday gatherings, the Houston Brown household held together by fragile threads. The adults tried to shield her. But according to those who saw her up close, Bobbi absorbed more than anyone realized. Her eyes tracked everything: the late arrivals, the whispered confrontations, the way Whitney sometimes drifted away in the middle of a room. When Whitney died in 2012, something in Bobbi seemed to snap. At the funeral in Newark, mourners recall seeing her clutch a folded photo of her mother so tightly the edges crumpled in her hand. Under her breath, she kept whispering, "Take me with you." Dionne pulled her aside and told her, "You're still here for a reason." But Bobbi stared past her, tears running silently, the words barely landing. By 2014, the pattern was unmistakable. Dionne visited Bobbi at the Georgia townhouse she shared with Nick Gordon. What she saw there, she would later describe as standing inside a replay. Bobbi moved through the small rooms like a ghost wearing Whitney's outline, thin, restless, hollow-eyed. Her hands shook when she sat too long in one place. At the kitchen sink, she avoided letting the water run over her skin, turning the faucet low, pulling back like it was too much. "I feel it more now," she murmured at one point, almost to herself. Whatever Mom felt, Dionne tried to pull her closer to the family, to wrap arms around her before she slipped any further into the emptiness her mother had left behind. But grief, isolation, and the gravity of that townhouse life tugged at Bobbi harder. Then came the 31st of January 2015, Roswell, Georgia, a quiet suburban neighborhood, still half asleep. At 10:25 a.m., a 911 call went out. Nick Gordon was heard screaming for help. Inside the townhouse bathroom, Bobbi Kristina Brown, just 21 years old, was found face down in her bathtub. The water was still warm. The details stunned first responders. According to internal accounts later discussed within the family, the scene felt disturbingly familiar. The bathroom air was heavy and damp. Towels were scattered on the floor. Candles were partially burned down. The echoes of Beverly Hilton's room 434 were impossible to miss. When the call reached Dionne, she didn't ask what had happened. She didn't demand an explanation. She said only one sentence. "It's repeating. I knew it would repeat." Bobby was rushed to North Fulton Hospital, then transferred and placed in a medically induced coma at Emory University Hospital. For 6 long months, Dionne visited, touching her hand, watching monitors, waiting for any sign of twitch. A squeeze, a breath that felt more intentional than automatic. Bobby never woke up. On the 26th of July 2015, surrounded by family, she died. 2 generations, 2 bathtubs, 2 eerily similar endings, 3 years apart. The public pointed fingers at relationships, at drugs, at emotional instability. Talk shows and headlines framed it as the tragic fallout of fame and chaos. Dionne's view was colder, quieter, more complicated. In her mind, this wasn't just cause and effect. It was continuation evidence of something older and deeper than any one decision or any one person. Some families pass down talent. Some pass down beauty. The Houston women, Dionne suggested, inherited something else, layered on top of all that. A silence that waited for them in water. A shared fear that followed them from adolescence into adulthood. A pattern that ended in 2 identical scenes: steam, porcelain, and stillness. When Dionne finally allowed herself to speak in more detail, she used a phrase that closed the debate for many people listening. "This wasn't coincidence," she said. "This was repetition. And once repetition like that starts, once a pattern like that locks in, it doesn't just stop on its own. It waits." If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. Some stories sit inside a family like sealed envelopes. Everyone knows they exist, but no one dares to open them. The truth inside is too heavy, too sharp, too close. For the Houston Circle, the years after Bobby Christina's death were not a clean arc of healing. They were years of avoidance. Years of pretending the pattern wasn't real. Years of trying to convince themselves that history hadn't just repeated in the most terrifying way imaginable. During that time, Dionne Warwick carried the pattern like a private burden. It showed in small ways. In the way her shoulders tensed at memorial galas, in the way her face tightened at tribute concerts, in the way she paused just a fraction too long when someone said Whitney's name in a room full of cameras. Every time a journalist asked about Whitney's legacy, she felt a stab of guilt because there was a piece of the story she was deliberately withholding. From 2016 to 2018, Dionne appeared at dozens of events honoring Whitney. Tribute shows, charity galas, foundation dinners, televised specials. Cameras captured her elegance and composure. But people who knew her say there were moments when the mask slipped. She would freeze for a heartbeat whenever a reporter mentioned the bathtub. Her hands shook just enough for close friends to notice when fans handed her photos of Whitney smiling in hotel rooms. At family gatherings, she carefully avoided looking at the spots where Whitney and Bobby used to sit, as if the empty chairs were louder than any conversation in the room. The silence around her only grew thicker with time. In early 2016, at a private meeting in Newark, Dionne and the Houston matriarch finally sat together long enough to stop avoiding what had been following them. They spent hours in a worn kitchen, surrounded by aging wallpaper and the faint smell of old vinyl gospel records. There, the matriarch began sharing memories she had kept buried since Whitney's teenage years. Moments of sudden fear in bathrooms, odd, unexplained panic. Times when Whitney would freeze at the edge of a tub, staring at the water like it was a threat. These episodes didn't connect to fame or albums or headlines. They were older, much older. As Dionne listened, the fragments she'd collected over the years, those late-night calls, the wedding day tremors, the bathtub confessions started snapping into place like puzzle pieces that had always belonged together. Whitney hadn't just become afraid of water during her final years. According to these family recollections, she had been unsettled by hot baths and heavy steam for most of her life. From 2017 to 2020, more memories surfaced bit by bit. Old stylist notes from the 90 seconds, tour crew stories from Europe, makeup artists who remembered Whitney refusing to soak in hotel tubs, asking for quick showers instead. A bodyguard recalled how, in Munich, Whitney flinched when her hand brushed the cold porcelain edge of a bathtub, jerking back as if she'd been burned. A backup singer remembered one night in Chicago when Whitney simply refused to bathe before a show, leaving the team confused and scrambling. On their own, these were just strange anecdotes, but together they traced a line of fear that stretched over decades, moving steadily toward the way her life ended. Then, around 2020, the outside world stumbled onto the edge of the story. It was said that a leaked recording from a Houston family friend surfaced online, hinting that Whitney had anticipated her own death in some way. The audio was unclear, distorted, incomplete, but it was enough to reignite a wildfire of speculation. Fans demanded explanations, old conspiracy theories resurfaced, blogs dissected every rumor and stray quote. And for the first time, Dionne realized that her silence was no longer protecting anyone, it was just feeding the chaos. So, in 2021, during a confidential interview for a book about Black American music legends, Dionne finally let some of the truth out. She didn't unload everything, but she shared enough to shift the conversation. She confirmed that both Whitney and Bobby had lived with an intense, lifelong fear of bathtubs, a dread that made no sense to most people, yet seemed to be the strongest thread connecting their final moments. The interviewer, according to those familiar with the project, went still when they heard it. They understood immediately. This one detail reframed everything. Still, her confession stayed off television. It didn't go viral. Not yet. In 2022, during the filming of a televised tribute, Dionne stepped into room 434 at the Beverly Hilton for the first time since Whitney's death. The room had been reset for cameras. Lighting rigs hummed. Crew members whispered directions, but Dionne barely seemed to hear any of it. She walked straight toward the bathroom door and placed her hand on the frame. Her face didn't show a dramatic breakdown, it showed recognition. A quiet acknowledgement, as if she were standing not just in a hotel room, but at the final chapter of a story that had been writing itself in her mind for decades. The crew felt the shift in the air, even if they didn't understand why. Then, in 2023, another detail surfaced that, for Dionne, changed everything again. It was said that internal notes from the Roswell police, related to Bobby Christina's case, resurfaced in supplemental files. Buried inside was a detail the public had never widely seen. When first responders found Bobby, the water in the tub was still unusually hot, far hotter than it should have been, given how long she was believed to have been unresponsive. That single line echoed Whitney's case with almost surgical precision. Hot water, steaming bathroom, time gaps that didn't fully make sense. To Dionne, that detail shattered any last hope that this was all random. She had spent years trying to shield the family from sensational narratives and cruel speculation. But this wasn't tabloid drama to her. It was a pattern too sharp, too exact, too horrifying to ignore. Finally, in 2024, during a televised interview, Dionne stopped speaking in fragments. She laid out her view clearly. She didn't frame it as a demon, a spell, or a supernatural curse. She called it a pattern, a generational wound, moving silently through the women of the Houston family. She spoke of trauma stored in the body, of fear passed down like an heirloom, of emotional scars resurfacing in eerily similar ways across two lives 3 years apart. She acknowledged that relationships, substances, and the brutality of fame all played their roles. But she also suggested that something older had been shaping the story from the background. A legacy of pressure, grief, and fear that no one had fully faced. Viewers were stunned. Articles and think pieces followed. Fan communities erupted in debate. Dionne's revelation didn't just reopen the case in the public imagination, it rewrote the emotional context of an entire musical dynasty. For the first time, people began to see Whitney and Bobby not just as icons and tabloid subjects, but as two women carrying the same shadow from childhood to their final breaths. And if that shadow truly ran through the Houston bloodline, then silence had never been protection. Silence had been permission. There are families whose tragedies feel like isolated lightning strikes, one disaster, then clear skies. And there are families whose pain moves in circles, repeating itself in different faces and different years. When Dionne Warwick finally chose to speak openly between 2016 and 2024, she made one thing clear. She did not see the Houston story as a ghost tale or a conspiracy movie. She saw it as something far more human and, in many ways, more devastating. In her view, the so-called Houston curse was never about an invisible force stalking the family. It was about a chain of injuries, emotional, psychological, and generational, woven through years of fame, expectation, and private suffering. She spoke about what it means to be a black woman at the center of American music history. The brilliance required, the pressure to be flawless, the exploitation that often creeps in behind the praise, the relentless demand to perform, to endure, to remain iconic, even when your personal life is collapsing backstage. In that light, what some people called a curse was, in Dionne's eyes, the cumulative effect of all those forces. The pressure of perfection, the trauma of being watched and judged by the world, the isolation of hotel rooms that never truly feel safe, the relationships that chipped away at their spirit long before the public noticed. To Dionne, these weren't supernatural events. They were the kinds of tragedies that families carry quietly buried but still alive, passed from mother to daughter, reappearing in patterns that look unsettlingly familiar. And yet, even as she grounded her explanation in psychology and lived experience, she admitted something else. Some details simply refused to fit neatly into rational categories. Some moments were too exact, too mirrored, too painfully aligned to be shrugged off as just coincidence. She talked about the contradictions in Whitney's final decade, the sleepless nights, the swings between euphoria and despair, the escalating anxiety that no amount of success could silence. She described Bobbi Kristina growing up inside that same atmosphere, inheriting not only her mother's talent and beauty, but also the unspoken fear, the unresolved tension, the grief that hung in the Houston home like unseen smoke. And then, after nearly 10 years of holding back, Dionne finally shared the memory that had stayed with her the longest. A moment in late 2011 when Whitney was worn down from months of emotional turbulence. In Dionne's retelling, Whitney didn't make a dramatic prophecy. She simply admitted how unsafe she felt inside her own mind. It was less a prediction and more a confession about fragility, a woman aware that stress, exhaustion, and old wounds were pushing her toward a breaking point. Dionne kept that moment to herself for years because it felt too intimate, too raw, and too closely tied to what happened just months later. What made it even more haunting was the parallel with something Bobbi had expressed years earlier, in 2008. Growing up in the fog of fame and sorrow, Bobbi developed her own fears, anxiety that echoed her mother's, dread that seemed to mirror what she'd watched Whitney endure. To Dionne, these weren't signs of a mystical curse. They were markers of untreated trauma, the way pain repeats itself when no one has the tools or the courage to confront it head-on. 2 generations, 2 women, bound by love, talent, and the same invisible weight. 2 lives shaped by emotional storms no one fully understood. And 2 tragedies that played out with details so eerily alike that the world could only gasp, then argue over what it all meant. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well. 3 days after Whitney Houston's death, while the world was still glued to breaking news banners and tribute montages, a very different kind of conversation unfolded behind closed doors. Inside the Houston circle, away from cameras and microphones, a family member, someone whose name Dionne Warwick has never publicly shared, pulled her aside with a detail that, according to Dionne, shook her more than any headline. It wasn't a lab result. It wasn't a police conclusion. It was an observation, a moment noticed in the chaos and never forgotten. According to this relative's account, when emergency responders found Bobbi Kristina 3 years later in 2015, the scene inside that Georgia bathroom felt disturbingly familiar. The room was thick with steam. The water in the tub was unusually hot. The whole setting, humid air, scalding bath, motionless body felt less like a new tragedy and more like a replay, a terrible echo of what had happened to Whitney at the Beverly Hilton. To Dionne, the weight of that detail wasn't about superstition. She didn't see it as proof that something mystical had returned to claim a second life. What hit her hardest was the emotional realization. The family hadn't just lost 2 women. They had watched the same circumstances circle back before they even had time to process the first loss. The same vulnerabilities, the same pressures, the same internal battles that had shaped Whitney's final years had, in this telling, also wrapped themselves around her daughter. When Dionne eventually chose to speak about that hot water detail in later years, she didn't use it to support a ghost story. She framed it as an illustration of what happens when trauma is never really addressed. In her view, the idea that someone wanted them found the same way wasn't a literal theory about an unseen presence. It was a metaphor, an image of how emotional wounds, when left untreated, tend to reproduce themselves with eerie accuracy. She didn't talk about forces beyond understanding. She didn't point to a curse cast from the outside. She talked about patterns. Dark, painful patterns that families often refuse to look at until they've already claimed too much. From Dionne's perspective, the Houston tragedies were not random accidents and not magical punishments. They were the culmination of deep emotional history, the pressure of fame, the endless cycles of stress, the inherited fear no one could fully name, the unresolved grief that seeped into every room, the isolating demand to remain iconic, polished, legendary, while your spirit is quietly cracking underneath. That, she said, was the real twist. Not that something supernatural had taken two lives, but that something profoundly human had shaped them. The pain, the expectations, the unspoken history had almost sculpted their destinies. This, according to Dionne, was the secret she carried the longest. Not a prophecy, not a curse, just a brutal truth. Tragedy doesn't always strike once and disappear. In families where pain goes unspoken, where survival matters more than honesty, tragedy tends to repeat, especially in families where suffering slowly turns into tradition, passed down quietly, silently, invisibly. So when she finally opened her mouth and let the story out, the world didn't just hear a tale about bathtubs and eerie timing. They heard a generational story about inherited fear, about emotional repetition, about how two lives can be pulled into the same ending by a history no one ever properly confronted. When you line up the timelines side by side, it becomes harder to lean on luck or coincidence as an explanation. 2 generations. The same fear, the same setting, the same ending. Patterns like that don't appear out of thin air. They come from somewhere, a buried wound, an emotional inheritance, or, for some, something even more unsettling that defies language. Whatever you choose to believe, one thing is difficult to deny. Nothing